guys, what's going on? Welcome back to another episode of Form Check Friday. We are inching our way through these submissions. We've got up to, I want to say like December 12th or so by the end of this video. We're just chipping away at it. If you sent submissions in, they will get answered, but it will take some time. Again, that's just kind of how this whole thing goes when it's free. It's the way we do things. Anyways, let's dive right into it. And today's first submission is bench press. Comes from a guy named Caden. Now, Caden, there's a couple things I'm noticing here. Biggest thing is right as you get to the bottom, and it kind of cuts off at the bottom of the frame, unfortunately. But what's happening is your elbows are coming back behind the bar is dumping into the chest and then coming back up. So, a couple of cues that I would use there is I would try to keep your elbows tucked a little bit more as you get to the bottom of the range of motion, and make sure that we stay relatively stacked straight up and down from the wrist where the bar is going to be. And the elbow, we don't want to be back here. We want to try to stay straight up and down, if not a tiny bit in front of the bar actually, on the descent. Now, the other thing I want you to work on cue-wise is I want you to think about a little bit of a lighter touch on the bottom of your bench press when you're touching. Try to be in better control, that bottom 2 to 3 inches of the range of motion. Try not to dump and bounce to get the bar back up, because if you ever end up competing in powerlifting, you're gonna have to pause on your chest, and that makes it a lot harder if you're used to just losing tension and trying to use that stretch reflex to get a bit of rebound to throw the bar back up. Now, in terms of some accessory movements that I would try to use is I would try to use some long pause bench presses, maybe some pin presses as well. Pin presses where the bar is coming to a stop on the pins at chest height. And those should help you get a little bit more comfortable with that bottom range of motion. And those should go a long ways towards fixing some of those things. That's about it for that. Hopefully it helps you out, man. Let me know how it goes. Our next submission here comes from Hayel. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. But Hayel made an interesting point in his email, and he said that my technique is good and everything feels good when the weights are light, but when the weights go heavy, I get loose and everything kind of falls apart technique-wise. And that leads us into kind of, I guess, my talking point for today, which is going to be choosing appropriate weights for training. Now, one thing that we want to do in terms of our technique, now this is going to be kind of independent of ideal training stress, maximum recoverable volume, et cetera, but one thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to get to a weight on the bar and a number of repetitions that's going to challenge the technique, but not break it. Something that's going to make you fight to maintain good technique, but a weight where you're able to do that, or a weight and rep range combo where you're able to maintain technique. If you're getting up to your top sets and your technique just turns into garbage, you're using too much weight. Use less weight, you know? If you're good at 50% and everything falls apart when you get to 90%, well, maybe you should be using 75% or 73% or 80% or somewhere in that range where you're able to maintain good technique. So in terms of choosing a good weight to put on the bar and a good rep range that's gonna pair with that, it should be something where you can maintain at least, Mike likes to use an 80% technique heuristic or general rule of thumb, that if you can maintain technique 80% of the time, you're good. And I would say that I very much agree with that. Just don't be putting weights on the bar where the technique's garbage for the sake of getting more weight on the bar, because you'll advance the weight you can put on the bar, but the technique's just gonna get worse and worse and worse, and you're gonna start making a lot more mistakes, and you're likely going to be more prone to injury from lifting with compromised mechanics. So that's my rant for the day. But anyways, let's get down to Hayel's. First thing that we have here is a bench press. Now this bench press, we're seeing almost exactly the same flaws as Caden. So the elbows in the bottom position are coming back behind, the bar's dumping forward, and we're getting really loose in the bottom. So cue-wise, keep the elbows under the bar, keep more tension down throughout the bottom range of motion, and accessory-wise, let's utilize some long pause bench press and some maybe low pin bench press to try and get yourself more comfortable and stronger in that bottom range of motion. Now the next thing Hayel submitted here are some 135-pound deadlifts. Now these look pretty good. I think the starting position could use a little bit of work still. I'd like to see you sit back a little more and sit down a little more. Try to get those shoulders straight in line over the bar. And let's get into a little bit more of a push with the quads kind of pattern off the floor. Something that can help you with that would be a pause deadlift or even a snatch grip deadlift, which is something I'm starting to use more and more with clients, something that I used a lot back in the day to reinforce more of an upright starting position. But it's essentially very much like the first pull of a snatch for an Olympic lifter. Because it puts you in such a compromised position, you kind of really have to sit down to use your quads off the floor and get into a good push pattern. So that I find can be a useful movement as well to try and cultivate that kind of technique. With Hayel's heavier deadlifts here, we can see that the number one thing is the T-spine, the thoracic spine, upper back really rounding out and causing him to end up out in front of the bar. He does a good job of locking his lats in, so I would say that the lats aren't what's giving out. It's actually some of the extensor musculature in terms of the pattern anyways. We're seeing a lot of loss of positioning in the back starting to go. So I would maybe do some extra back work, and I would also try to keep the weights, like I said, light enough that you can maintain that nice neutral back position that we had with 135. Obviously, this is a bit too much weight with these heavier sets. And the last thing we're gonna look at from Hayel here is some light squats. Now, a couple things with the light squats. Number one, Hayel, they're still high. You still need to squat deeper. It looks like you're very capable of doing that, so let's just push that depth. I don't think that it's necessarily any sort of restriction or anything. I think you're just in the pattern of squatting a little bit high, so let's just sit a little deeper. The other thing that I'm seeing a little bit of is a little bit of overextension. So conversely to the deadlift, with this movement, we're seeing a little bit too much arching with the lower and mid back. And what I'd like to see is a little bit more ribs down and trying to maintain a bit more of a neutral spinal position as opposed to an overly extended spinal position. Anyways, that's it for Hayel stuff. I think there were a couple more clips in that video, but trying not to detract from anybody else's sort of attention or experience here. So we're gonna make the decision to cut it there and move on to our next submission. So our next submitio vidmission comes from Christopher. Now Christopher's doing some squats here, and a couple of things that I'm noticing. The biggest things are just going maybe a little bit too deep. I think you're at a point where you're achieving depth in terms of getting to a competition standard. We're seeing the hip crease pass below the top of the knee, and then you're going an extra 1.5 to 2 inches, which is where we're seeing some looseness and some poor mechanics in terms of the way that the trunk is braced and tightness and that kind of thing. So the biggest thing I would try to get you to do is just squat a little bit higher. Now, a couple of movements that can help with this would be a tempo squat, whether it's a 3 tempo down, 3 seconds up, or whether it's like a 6-second eccentric, like kind of the stuff that I'm doing right now. Either way, feeling out that movement pattern with a more slow and controlled intention can help you create good new patterns and break old substandard patterns. That's one thing that I'm finding with my tempo squats actually as I do them and my tempo bench is it's allowing me to get a little bit more consistent and purposeful with how I'm moving. So I find those tempos really useful and I would recommend using those. As well as a pause squat, probably more than a pin squat variation here. With the pause squat, one of the advantages is you're having to create the bottom position yourself. You're not relying on the pins to tell you where the bottom is. So you can film it from the side or from a similar angle to what you've submitted here and get to a point where you're creating that good amount of tension and stopping yourself just after depth, as opposed to going all the way down to use more of that stretch reflex. If you stay oriented differently, we can probably find good stretch reflex at a depth that's just below parallel as opposed to way below parallel and needing, sacrifice and positioning, those kinds of things. Anyways, I hope that helps, Christopher. Our next submission comes from Vid. Now, Vid's doing some conventional deadlifts. He's a young guy. He's just getting started with lifting here and kind of wanted some advice before he solidifies his technique. Now, I actually really like most of what you're doing here, Vid. Your starting position's pretty good. I think we could cue the knees out just a little bit. I think we're seeing maybe a little bit of knee crash, causing the glutes to be in a little bit less advantaged position. So we're maybe not getting as much out of those positions as possible. So when you're initiating the movement, try to keep those knees tracked out over your toes. It looks like we're having a little bit of knee crash, which is causing the low back to round out just a tiny bit. So that's one of the things I would look at. And the other thing is we're kind of overcompensating when we get to the top of the movement. And it looks like from about mid-thigh up, you're really focusing on pulling through with the back and pulling the back into extension. What I'd like to see there, what I would coach you to do there, is instead finish with hip extension and work on trying to get your glutes fully contracted to lengthen through the hip joint as opposed to finishing with back extension. So try to keep your trunk nice and tight and in a similar position to what it has been through the lift, and just squeeze your butt as hard as you can, essentially, to bring yourself to hip extension as opposed to really overextending that back. So we're putting more emphasis on stressing the hips as an extending joint as opposed to the back and its many joints. Other than that, things look pretty darn good. And I'm stoked to see that you're getting into lifting and that you've picked up the deadlift as well as you have so far. And the last submission here we have comes from Thomas. Now, Thomas is doing some squatting here. The first thing I'm noticing, sorry, I'll just flip over to Thomas there. First thing I'm noticing is we're again into a little bit of an overextended pattern, kind of like I was talking about with Hayel. So really kind of opening the ribs instead of keeping the ribs clamped down on top of the abs. I think with better bracing patterns, and you can watch one of our videos, I talked about, I think it's called 2 Things That Helped Fix My Squat. And I talked a little bit about the bracing patterns and some of the cues that I like to use there. The biggest one being clamping the ribs down on top of the abs. Another popular cue in terms of the bracing is thinking about 360-degree expansion through the trunk, through the abs, obliques, and low back, and just getting out of that pattern of really reaching the chest up too high. What I think that's doing is I think that's causing you an exaggerated sticking point. I think that's part of the reason why we're getting to a very pronounced sticking point and having to kind of fight through that almost right from the get-go. So what I'd like to see you do is work on that bracing pattern and see if we can't smooth out that really exaggerated sticking point. The other video that Tom submitted is a deadlift, and honestly, I'm just gonna say that it looks damn good. I'm pretty happy with that. There isn't really anything that I would, anything major that I would worry about changing there, so just keep doing what you're doing with that. And that brings us to a close for Form Check Friday today. I hope everybody got something out of today. And if you have any questions or comments on any of the videos we talked about, if you're a lifter featured and you wanted to ask further questions about what I had to say about your lift, please go ahead and ask your questions below in the comments section. Leave a like if you liked it. Hit subscribe if you want to see some more of this stuff. And we will see you guys next week for Form Check Friday.